So it is a pleasure for us to have Professor Galit Yovel with us today. Galit Yovel is a professor at the School of Psychological Sciences and a member of the Sagol School of Neuroscience at Tel Aviv University. Professor Galit Yovel completed her BSc in psychology and philosophy at Tel Aviv University, then moved to Chicago to do an MSc in psychology and psychobiology and a PhD at psychology at the University of Chicago. Her PhD was done under the supervision of J.R. Levy and Ken Poller, where she already started to investigate face perception and its underlying neural mechanisms. Her first postdoc was in Northwestern University, and then she moved to a second postdoc in Nancy Kanwisher's lab at MIT. She then joined the faculty the Tel Aviv University Department of Psychology, which is now the School of Psychological Sciences, where she leads the person recognition lab. She published dozens of papers, including in top leading journals as Neuron, Current Biology, Annual Review of Vision Science, Trends in Cognitive Sciences, and others, and also several book chapters. She was awarded multiple prestigious awards for her research and for her teaching. She investigates person perception through face, body, and vocal cues using behavioral, neuroimaging, and computational approaches. And today, we're very pleased to have you here, Galit, with us to tell us about your research. So welcome to our seminar.
Okay, thanks so much, Sharon, for the invitation, and thank you for organizing this really awesome seminar, vision seminar. It's really great to be here. I'll share my screen. All right. And what I'll try to do in my talk today is to answer this question of, just a second, in my mouse here, of how do humans recognize faces. And before we dive into faces, let me start with a more general question of what is actually the goal of vision. And I hope you would agree with me that an important goal of vision is recognition. So for example, if we go to do our grocery shopping here in the Carmel market in Tel Aviv, to get our fruits and vegetables, we need to be able to discriminate zucchinis from cucumbers and peaches from apples. So we need to be able to assign those different visual images to their correct categories. And let's say that we also run into one of our friends. So in order to behave in a socially appropriate manner, we need to recognize their faces. And that brings us to face recognition. So here again, in order to be able to recognize familiar faces, we need to be able to assign them to their categories, to their different identities. So in essence, the problem of face recognition is a problem of classification. We need to be able to generalize across different appearances of the same identity and to discriminate among different images of different identities. And the reason this task is hard is because when we measure those faces at a pixel-based representation, different images of different identities are more similar or more closer to one another than different images of of the same identity. So what we need to do is we need to find the dimensions or the features that move different images of the same identity closer together and different images of different identities farther apart. So in essence, what we need the system to do is to convert a pixel-based representation to an identity-based representation, okay? So this is going to be the framework of my talk. And what I'll try to do is to answer two questions in order to be able to find out how we recognize faces. One would be, what are the features or the dimensions that define the identity of the face, that define this identity face space? And the second is how these features are learned. And I'm going to primarily show you data from psychophysical experiments and also from deep convolutional neural networks, which are brain-inspired algorithms that recently reached human-level performance on face recognition tasks. So we wanted to see whether we can use these algorithms in order to get some insights on human face recognition. Okay. And if anybody has a question, you can actually unmute and ask me during the talk. That will be great. So let's start with the first question. Something got stuck. Okay. So what are the features or the dimensions of this face space that define the identity of a face? So that was a question that Naftali Abu-Laham asked when he started his PhD with me a few years ago. And based on a series of psychophysical experiments, I'll show you them relatively briefly, he wanted to find out what are the features that define the identity, the face space. So there are several articles that described the face space model, which basically suggests that we can represent faces as dots in a multidimensional feature space, such that different faces, the distance between different faces corresponds to their perceptual sensitivity. And these papers never defined the specific features that are used in order to construct this identity face space. So in order to do that, what he did is he started with a list of 20 different features. These features were taken from the list that the police is used for suspect identification. And in order to be able to find the locations of these faces in the face space, he asked participants to rate each of those different a set of different faces across for each of those different features. So for example, they had to rate how large is the nose, how wide is the face, how thick are the eyebrows, and so on for all those 20 features. And based on the measurements, we can now define for each of those different features their value. And we also standardize these values so we can measure the relative location of those different faces. So based on this feature vector representation, we can now locate the face in this face space, okay? And we can do it for other faces in our data set, and this would be the location of that face, and this would be the location of other faces in our data set based on the feature vector representation in this 20-dimensional feature space. Now, based on this feature-based representation, we can now compute the distance between different faces based on this feature vector representation. And in order to find out whether these features indeed correspond to the identity of the face, we can correlate this distance measure with similarity ratings given by a different group of subjects of the same pairs of faces, where they had to say whether the two faces are similar or different, let's say from 1 to 6. And when we looked at the correlation, we found that these distances between face space that are measured based on these features is actually quite highly correlated with the similarity rating that were given for the whole faces from a different group of subjects, and basically suggesting that those 20 features can account for identity perceptual measures. Now, another thing that we realized when we collected this data is that there was difference between the agreement, the correlations, the inter-rater correlations of the subjects on those different features. So for example, we found that it was easier to rate lip thickness. There was higher agreement to rate lip thickness and lower agreement to rate mouth size. And we refer to this measure as a perceptual sensitivity. So we have a higher perceptual sensitivity to rate lip thickness than mouth size. And what we thought is that the features for which we have higher perceptual sensitivity may be more important for the identity of the face than the features for which we have lower perceptual sensitivity. And in order to find out, to quantify that, we computed the same correlation that you see here on the right, but only based on subset of these features. So we can compute the correlation based only for the distance based on lip thickness, what you see here on the first dot on this plot. And the correlation is going to be very low because it's only based on one feature, but then we can add more features one by one. And once we get to 5 features, you can see that we get to the maximal correlation. So what this basically suggests that we don't really need all 20 features to define the identity of the face. We can use only the first 5 features. We can also look at the same thing going from the other direction. So starting at the correlation, looking at mouth size and then add eye distance. You can see it from the right to the left. And we see that we get the maximal correlations only when we include those features here on the left, the features for which we have high perceptual sensitivity, and whereas the features for which we have low perceptual sensitivity may not account for face identification. Okay, so this is what we found based on this correlational analysis, and then we wanted to see whether those features are indeed important for defining the identity of the face. So the high PS features are hair, eyebrow thickness, lip thickness, eye color, and eye shape. And the low PS features are face proportion, eye distance, mouth size, nose size, and skin color. And just to remind you, we are now looking for the features that define the identity of the face. So in order to find out whether they're indeed critical for face identification, we defined critical features as features that's changing them would change the identity of the face. And we try to see what happens when we change those high PS features. So this is the original face. And now we can start changing those features based on the features that were rated by our participants. So when we change those features, we know by how much exactly we move the face in our database, because they're all rated. And we change the hair, the eyebrow thickness, the eye shape and eye color, and the lip thickness. So after changing these 5 features, we see that we get a face that looks very different, looks like a different identity face. Whereas when we change the low PS features, I think that you can see that we can still identify the face, changing the skin color, the face proportion, the nose, and the mouth. The way we quantify that is we ask participants to rate how similar or different are those faces, whether this is the same face or a different face after changing the 5 high PS features or the low PS features. And we compare that to a rating that we found, we collected for different identity faces and same identity faces. Okay, so that would be our references. And the dissimilarity measure for same identity faces is obviously low. The dissimilarity measure for the different identity faces was high. And the measure, the dissimilarity ratings for faces that differ in high PS features, you see that they're as different as different identity faces. And that was our definition of critical features. Critical features are features that changing them change the identity of the face. So we can take any face, just replace those five features and get a different identity face. And when we change the low PS features, we still can see the same identity of the face. The similarity rating are lower. Now, despite these very large perceptual differences that we get between those faces, when we look at the pixel-based measures and the distance between those faces based on the pixel-based measures, we see that they're very similar. So the differences between those pairs of faces emerges based on their perceptual representation and not based on their pixel-based representation. Okay, so this data suggests that these features seem to be important for face identification. They seem to be the dimensions that the system uses in order to define face identity. But then the next question is why they are critical, why they are important for face identification. And as I mentioned to you earlier, what we need in order to define the identity of a face is we need features that remain invariant across different head views and are different across different identities. So what we hypothesize is that maybe those features are important is because they are view invariant. They remain similar across different head views. And the way we quantify that was by asking participants now to compare between these features across different faces. Okay, so they had to say which one has thicker eyebrows, which nose is larger, again, for all the 20 different features. For faces, the same view, and we computed again the perceptual sensitivity for each of those features. And then we did the same thing with another group of subjects for faces across different head views. Now, features that are view invariant are going to have the same perceptual sensitivity for faces from same view and different view. So the difference between perceptual sensitivity for same view faces and different view faces is going to be minimal. Whereas features that are not view invariant, differ across different head views, are going to have a large difference between same difference and same view and different view. So what you see here down on the right are the invariant features, features for which changing the head view did not change perceptual sensitivity, whereas the features on the left are those for which there is a large drop in perceptual sensitivity. What we actually see is that the features that were invariant were also the critical features. Features that I showed you earlier are important for face identification. So those features are also invariant across different head views. So for example, when we look at the eyebrow thickness, we can compare those two faces based on eyebrow thickness, both when the faces are presented in frontal, as well as different view, also for the hair, the eye shape. But the eye distance or the face proportion are harder to compare for faces.
Galit, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Did you also test it with full profile? I mean, completely from the side, because in the picture here it's 45%.
No, we didn't do it with full profile, and I know that usually with full profile, things usually drop significantly. Also, when we try to compare faces for identity judgments, usually and again, I mean, in some of these features should remain such as eyebrow thickness or hair, also across different head views, and some would drop. Okay, what here we did a 3/4 change. Basically, by using these features, what we suggest is that by using these features, we can generate this identity-based representation where the faces that are different across different appearances of the same face across different head views are going to be closer together, and different identity faces are going to be farther apart. Okay, so what I showed you so far is primarily based on face matching, just looking at two faces and compare the distance or the similarity between them. As I mentioned earlier, the main goal of the system, the main goal of face recognition, is to identify familiar faces. So what we wanted to see is whether those features are also used for recognition of familiar faces. And for that, we use celebrity faces, and we did the same thing. We changed their features, the critical features and the non-critical features. So now you can be a participant in our experiment and try to guess who that person is. So this is a famous person. You're all familiar with that person. We did it
Tom
for
Hanks.
not Tom Hanks. And so, and you actually have an advantage over our participants because you know what are the 5 features that I changed. Our participant didn't know anything. They just had to look at the face and decide who that person is. Okay. So this is not Matt Damon. Don't feel badly. Nobody can recognize those faces after we change 5 features. I'll show you the data in a second. Okay, so I'm now going to replace one of those features, just one by one. There are only 5 features that we change here, and see at what point you can recognize the person. So these are the original eyebrows of that person. Okay, this is the original eye shape, eye color. Okay, now you're all going to recognize because I'm going to show the hair. Okay, so that's Justin Bieber, not yet with the lips of Justin Bieber, but this is Justin Bieber. Okay, another example. We did it with a bunch of faces. It works for all the faces, original eyebrows. Okay, so you can see here that when we change the high PS features, or what I call the critical features, we get a new identity, and we find it also with a face recognition task. When we change the low PS features, you can still recognize George Clooney from when we change those 5 different features. So this is the data across a number of faces. Changing 4 or 5 features that are the critical features completely change the identity of the face. There is 0% recognition of those faces. And when we change the non-critical features, we see that we can still recognize good proportion of these faces. Okay, so based on this series of experiments, the perceptual experiments, the recognition experiment, we found this subset of 5 features: the hair, the eyebrow thickness, lip thickness, eye color, and eye shape, and that seemed to be critical for the identity of the face, or the dimensions of this identity-based face space. All right.
Galit, can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
So if you just kind of look at these critical features, right, they mostly seem to be very feature or local based. They seem to be about color or kind of these identifiable features of the face. Whereas the low critical features are more about distance and shape, which would be more underlying like global processing, which we at least traditionally think of as being important for face recognition. So can you say anything about how the critical versus non-critical features that you found, like how they fold into the existing literature and what we know about face processing, as well as maybe differences between like familiar or personally familiar faces versus unfamiliar faces?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there are other distinctions that were used in the literature with respect to features. So there's the spacing and the part-based, right? And there is the external versus internal. And this is not consistent with any of them, right? It shows that the external features are important, such as the hair. It shows that actually spacing is not as important as we realized. And I think what we did here that maybe was not done before is that we were really interested in what remains invariant across different head views. And once we looked at that, we realized that the spacing is actually cannot be used in order to generalize across different faces, different images across different head views. And actually those features that remain invariant and are useful for the identification. And in particular, actually the hair, which is cropped in many face studies. So even for famous faces, the hair seems to be quite critical. So this is just based on this type of measures and our attempt to try to find those features that are invariant in order to generate this identity-based face space that we managed to find those features. But when we started these experiments, we had no clue what we are going to find. Okay, so it was really based on the data that we collected. Okay, and yeah, another question?
I actually have a question. I want to ask, what was the task? I mean, they had to guess who this person is after they knew that there were some manipulations done to the face?
No, they were just presented with the faces and they had to say who that person was. They didn't know anything about the feature manipulation, but they figured it out because it was a serial experiment. So we started with the 5 features of all the faces and then the 4 features of all the faces and so on.
Okay.
Okay,
Thanks.
all right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now there is something that may be unsatisfying with this list of features, right? Because they're based on features that we have names for, right? And we may want to have some confirmation that these features are important also from other types of systems. And this is where we used our the deep convolutional neural networks. So these networks are ignorant about these features, right? They are trained in order to identify faces. And what we wanted to know is whether we can get some insights from these networks about the importance of these features. So I'll just say a few brief words about deep convolutional neural networks. So these are brain-inspired algorithms that are structured in a hierarchical manner such that they get the pixel-based representation, and across the different layers of the network, they generate different representations. And these different representations are generated based on what is known as is called supervised learning. So they are trained with face images that are labeled, and they change the weights of the connections between the different layers in a way that will enable the network to discriminate between same identity faces and different identity faces of the trained database. And based on the representations that the network is generated for the trained images, we can now use it in order to measure the distances between faces that the system was not trained with and see what type of representations are generated. So we took this face-trained DCNN that is trained to identify faces and reach human level performance. And we measured the distance between pairs of faces, either same identity faces or different identity faces from the same view or different views. And what you see here on the left is the pixel-based representation. So each image is a feature vector based on the pixels, and we measure the Euclidean distance. And what you see is what I showed you earlier, that the distance between different identity faces is more smaller, is lower than the distance between same identity faces presented from different views. Okay, so these are the blue bars. And what you'll see here on the right is the representation that is generated by the final layer of the network that is used in order to classify faces to same and different identities. And we again measure the distance between these pairs of faces, and you see that at the final layers we get this identity-based representation. The distance between different identity faces is larger, and the distance between same identity faces gets smaller. So the system learns the features that can be used in order to discriminate different identity faces and generalize across different images of the same identity. We can also look at the network, at how this representation evolves across its different layers. So you see the initial layers, we still get this view-specific representation. And when we get to its final layers, then the different identity faces, the distance between them gets larger, and the distance between same identity faces gets smaller. Okay. All right, and now we want to see whether the system is, the network is also sensitive to the same critical features that are used by human for face identification. So this is the data I showed you before. These are human dissimilarity ratings. We get high dissimilarity ratings for faces with different critical features, and then non-critical features, and the pixel-based representation, they are all similar distance. And now we can look at the distances between each of those pairs of faces based on the feature vector representation of the network. And we see that we get something which is very similar to humans. So this face trained network is sensitive to the same features that humans use for face identification. And again, we didn't train the system on these faces, not on these features. It was trained to identify faces, and we now use untrained images in order to see what is the nature of the representation that the system generates. And here again, we can look at how it emerges across its different layers. So in the initial layers, we see that the distance between these pairs of faces is small, and it's getting larger as we get to higher layers of the network. What we also found is that the correlation between sensitivity to those critical features, which we measure by the difference between critical and non-critical features, is highly correlated with the performance of each of those layers on a face identification task. So the performance on face identification task is best in the final layers than in the initial layers. And this is also highly correlated with the sensitivity of each layer to critical features. Okay, so this seems to provide some evidence that both humans and those deep convolutional neural networks, which are trained on face identity, seem to rely on the same critical features. Okay, so if there are no further questions on this part, then I want to move now to the second question of how these features are learned. Okay, and I'm going to divide it into two separate questions. First, I'm going to ask whether these features depend on experience with faces versus experience with non-faces, and then ask what type of experience. So the reason we ask whether these features depend on experience with faces is because we know both from cognitive studies and from neural studies that faces are processed by specialized mechanisms. And what we are wondering is whether in order to learn these critical features, we need specific experience with faces, or these are general features that we can also learn by experience with object recognition. So what we hypothesize that the reason we may need to get to specialized face mechanisms is because a system that is optimized for object recognition is not going to be sensitive enough for those critical features. So we need a system that is specifically trained on faces in order to generate the sensitivity to these critical features. So in order to find out, we train the same network, but instead of training it to identify faces, we now train the same network to categorize different objects. So it was trained on 1,000 different categories of objects, and we now can look again at the nature of the representation that is generated by a face trained network and an object trained network, and see whether we need to train the system on faces in order to get this sensitivity to view invariant features and to critical features. So this is what I showed you before. These are the representation of a face trained network. It's showing a view invariant representation. It's sensitive to identity information. And this is what we get with an object trained network. So the object trained network represents faces in a view specific manner. There's not much difference between the representation that is generated in the final layer of the network than the initial layer. What is also interesting is when we look at the initial layers of both networks, they're actually pretty similar. And the difference emerges only at the higher layers. And this may be consistent with our visual system, where we process faces and objects using the same features in low-level visual areas, and they diverge to face regions and object regions in more higher-level regions, where we develop this specialization for features that are important for face identification. This is what we get for the critical features. So these are the face-trained DCNN I showed you before, and this is the object-trained DCNN. So the object-trained DCNN is not as sensitive to those critical features as the face-trained DNN. Again, in the earlier layers, they seem pretty similar, but the difference primarily emerges at the higher layers of those systems. Okay, so it seems that in order to learn the features that define the identity of the face, the system needs to be trained to get some experience on face identification. And then the next question we wanted to answer is what type of experience? So what type of experience we need to have with faces in order to learn to identify faces? And I'm going to talk about two types of experience. One is perceptual experience, which is primarily what I talked about so far. It's experience that we have with the visual images, with perceptual features. But I also want to talk now about the important role of conceptual experience. And why conceptual experience? Going back to what we talked earlier is that we think that the main goal of the face recognition system is to recognize familiar faces. The social interaction that we have with faces in our daily life is the interaction with familiar faces. And then familiar faces are not pure percepts, but they're actually linked to unique conceptual information. And if this is the main data that we get experience with, what we thought is that this conceptual information, this unique conceptual information, may also play an important role in the process by which we learn to identify faces. So what I'll do now is I'll show you three different experiments where we try to look at the effect of conceptual experience and perceptual experience. And in order to do that, we need to find a way to dissociate between them, because in familiar faces, we have both rich perceptual experience and rich conceptual experience. So we need to find a way to dissociate between those two different types of experience in order to find out whether conceptual experience actually play an important role. So the original study in which we did that was a study we ran a few years ago. And this is actually the study that made us realize that conceptual information may be important. And this is a study in which we used these newborn faces. So newborn faces, as you can see, all look very similar to one another. They are, these are 8 different infants, and it's hard to discriminate between them. And the reason it may be hard to discriminate between them is probably maybe because they don't have these critical features. They don't have hair, they don't have eyebrows. Maybe we just don't have the experience, the perceptual experience, in order to discriminate between them. So, and the way we can use those stimuli in order to dissociate between perceptual and conceptual experience is by testing a specific group of subjects, which are neonatology nurses. So neonatology nurses are have very extensive perceptual experience with newborn faces, but they never become familiar, right? They're just the type of experience is really pure perceptual. That's quite unique because usually when we get experience with perceptual aspects of faces, we also get some conceptual information about them. So that enables us to study the contribution of perceptual experience without any involvement of conceptual knowledge about those different faces. So what we did is we gave the nurses and a control group of subjects a task in which they had to learn different faces, newborn faces and adult faces, and we tested them on in a face recognition task. And this can enable us to answer the questions whether a human can learn to recognize faces only based on pure perceptual learning. So that was the task. They were presented with newborn faces and adult faces, and they had to learn them in a face recognition task. And then they had to say which of those 4 different faces were presented during study. Okay, so here it was 1-to-1, and these are the newborn faces. Okay, so you can see that the task is much harder for newborn faces and adult faces, and this is the performance that we got in the control group of subjects, which is librarians at the university that are matched for gender and age. And running the same task on the nurses, what we found is exactly the same thing. So getting this extensive real-life perceptual experience with unfamiliar faces that is primarily perceptual and without any conceptual information did not seem to contribute or did not improve their face recognition. Now, there are 2 alternative explanations that we also wanted to address. One is that maybe it's impossible to discriminate newborn faces, and another that maybe 2 or 3 days of exposure to those faces is not enough. So we now collected data from students in which we gave them this task, but now we used labeled faces. So they had to learn to discriminate between those different faces by associating them to different names. So this was Danny and John and Josh and David. And initially, before the training, we found, and then we ran the same task that we ran on neonatology nurses. So performance was better for adult faces and newborn faces before training. And we see that after training, performance for the newborn faces was almost at the ceiling, suggesting that we can discriminate between newborn faces if we learn them with some conceptual information. And the more interesting thing was to see whether we get any improvement also with novel faces that the subjects were not trained on. And we found that, yes, there was also some improvement for novel faces that were not included in the training. So basically, this suggests that conceptual experience with familiar faces, okay, associating faces with different labels, and I'm using names as just one example of information that we can associate with faces, but it can be any conceptual information that we have about faces. Most people, all people have conceptual information that is unique to their identity, and it can be the voice, the smell, any semantic information that we have about people, and that can be used as a label for learning those faces in a conceptual manner. And by learning familiar faces, we can see that we can also improve our performance on unfamiliar faces. And the way we think it's done is that when we use this categorization task, categorizing faces to different identities by associating them with different labels, we activate those critical features. So subjects need to find what are the features that are going to help them to discriminate between those different faces. And these features can be used also for faces that they were not trained with. And this is not specific to faces. Category learning has been used with also with auditory sounds, with other type of visual information. It was shown in kids So this is a general phenomena that category learning can improve recognition by activating those critical features.
Galit, can I ask a question? I wanted to ask if you thought about taking these baby faces or infant babies and putting them into the network and seeing if you will also get the same distances. And also, I'm wondering whether you think that the features that people are extracting in order to create these associations are the same critical features that you found.
So sorry. So first, about the first question, we actually haven't done that. We haven't tried to look at the. So in order to find the critical features, we need to do all these feature manipulations, which you haven't done for these newborn faces. But what we know actually is that those networks are also very good at the database that they are trained on. So we know that, for example, there is an other race effect in deep convolutional neural networks similar to humans. And again, it may be the case that the features that we need for Asian faces are different than we know that at least some of these features are different than the features that we use for Caucasian faces. So this would be similar both in the network and in humans, and that would also be the case also for these infant faces, as I mentioned earlier.
Okay.
Can I ask? Is gender maybe a difference between subjects, like men will recognize less, or the young mother will recognize more, or something like that?
No, so we didn't find any gender differences. I thought you were asking about the gender of the infant face.
No, not the infants, the subjects.
Right. No. So there was no differences between, there was no gender differences. But an interesting thing is that despite the fact that we can discriminate infant faces based on their identity, we cannot tell the gender of infant faces. Okay, so this is information that is not cannot be extracted from infant faces. We can extract this information only later on with more adult faces.
Thank you.
Galit?
Yeah.
Just I'm wondering, how can you check this contextual thing in the neural networks idea? And then I thought, okay, so you might want to feed the network with the pictures and an additional feature, right? That would, I don't know, the name or something contextual, and then do the test without this additional feature. And then you have this expectation that at least the higher level layers would be more like more sensitive, right?
So actually the networks are trained in a supervised manner, right? They are trained with labels, and those networks don't get to human level performance where they're trained in an unsupervised manner, right? So I think that in that sense, they're already trained with labels, and that would be a similar way to which we learn to recognize familiar faces. And when I summarize everything, this is where I'm going to go, that we learn these features based on our experience with familiar faces. This experience is not purely perceptual, but it's also conceptual in the sense that those images are always associated with unique conceptual information, and this information helps us figure out what are the important features. And then we can also generalize them to unfamiliar faces. Okay, but the main training is, yeah.
So the idea that the tagging is actually the contextual information, the tagging that you feed into it.
Right, it helps you during learning in order to find what are the features that discriminate different identities versus same identity.
Galit, to follow up, but networks can generalize to new faces, to new identities, and we humans cannot do it, apparently.
No, we can. This is the new faces are.
I mean, the non-familiar faces, we are not. I mean, you showed very nicely that for unfamiliar faces, we are not very good in.
Yeah, it's not. I'm going to get to the unfamiliar faces in a second.
Okay, okay.
But we can. We're not as good because, and that's again consistent with the idea, is that we are tuned to the features of the familiar faces. Some of them are general features that can be generalized to unfamiliar faces, but that may not be as good as familiar faces. But I'm going to get to that in the next, the last experiment.
Michael,
mhm.
sorry, Michael, Michael Tart, I see you raised a hand. Do you want to ask something?
Yeah, I was just going to comment. Thank you. I was just going to comment if you wanted to address the issue of the perceptual representation of the baby faces within the network, probably the way to do it would be to take the adult trained network and then just simply do transfer learning or fine tuning using the baby faces. Because in that case, what you would get is the similarity space for all of the baby faces with reference to the feature space that was actually learned with the adult faces, which would give you some measure probably of the way people would represent the baby faces over the couple of days of training that you do. So that'd probably be your closest approximation. And you could just take like the penultimate layer of the network and look at the similarity representation of the baby faces at that point. And that would tell you if they're equally spread out or less discriminable than the adult faces.
Right, yeah, sure. So we can do it by fine tuning the network on the newborn faces, or we can also look at the distances between those different infant faces based on the adult trained network. And actually, since you mentioned fine tuning, what we also see is that in order to get this sensitivity to the critical features, we don't need to fully train the network on faces. We can get an object trained network and we can just fine tune the last 2 or 3 layers with faces. And this is enough in order to get this face-based representation, this sensitivity to the critical features, to the head views, and so on. But sure, we can get those infant-based, the infant faces and measure the distances between them. The main limitations that we had in that study, which I'm going to talk about now, is that we only have 1 image per infant, per identity for these infant faces. We got those faces from a hospital that uploaded the newborns that were born every day. So we could get many different identity faces, but we could get only 1 image per face. So what we wanted to do next is wanted to see whether we could get some generalization to different images in after this conceptual experience training. And the other thing is that we wanted to find out whether this association of faces with labels is only is improving performance only because it's just a way to get the subject to be more attended to the faces. So maybe when you encode faces perceptually, you are less attending the different features and information than when you train with them conceptually. So what we did in another study, this is a series of studies that Lino Schwartz in my lab did, was presenting subject with labeled and unlabeled faces. This time we used adult faces. And we compared between recognition of these faces, the labeled and the unlabeled faces, to the same faces presented from different views. That's just to see that we can get the same effect for a different image of the same identity. And what you see here is the difference between performance for labeled faces and unlabeled faces when we use subjects, we use the people's names. Okay, so there are John and Jim and Mike and Paul versus faces presented with no names. They had to learn them and then they had to recognize them in an all new task. So there is a difference between faces that were learned with names and without names. What we then did is we wanted to know whether it's going to work with any label or only with labels that are conceptually meaningful. So subjects were trained on the same task, but now we used these symbols. Okay, so each face was associated with a different symbol. They had to learn them. And again, we compared between performance for labeled and unlabeled faces. And we see that using this type of labels actually didn't improve recognition for labeled versus non-labeled faces. We also tried it with object names. So each face was associated with a different object name. And this also does not improve recognition for labeled than non-labeled faces. We tried female names with male faces, and we get sort of some improvement, but it was not significant. And finally, we used occupations. So these are labels that we are that are conceptually associated with faces. This is a teacher, this is a manager, And we see that when we use conceptually relevant features, again, we get this benefit of learning faces with labels than without labels. So it seems that there is an importance for learning faces as concept, as linking them to labels that are conceptually consistent in this process by which we learn to associate faces with different identities. Okay, and now,
sorry.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So I'm trying to kind of break apart this issue of conceptual versus perceptual information, right? I mean, which you somewhat did with this last experiment in terms of conceptual information that is socially consistent or relevant. And I'm trying to figure out, in thinking about it, what is it that you think is happening? Do you think that when you give conceptually relevant information, then perceptually the faces, the perceptual difference between the faces actually becomes bigger? So they move further apart and therefore are more easily perceptually distinguished later? Or do you think that it has maybe something to do with existing memory and encoding with, this supporting existing memory network of conceptual knowledge that therefore allows you to increase task performance later? Have you thought about?
Right. So let me, I'll present the last experiment and then I'll kind of like summarize everything, and I'll try to answer to that. Okay. Okay. So in the final experiment, what we again wanted to try to measure is this contribution of the conceptual information to face identity, and this we related to what Rafi mentioned earlier. These findings by Rob Jenkins and Mike Barton and Young from the past few years, where they show that face recognition is relatively poor for unfamiliar faces, where it's much better for familiar faces. So as you can see here in this example, it's easier to generalize across different images of Julia Roberts than for images that are unfamiliar, both from the same race and also, and even more so, from different races. So it's hard to tell whether those different images belong to the same identity or different identity for the unfamiliar faces than the familiar faces. The answer is same identity, by the way, for the unfamiliar faces. And what we were wondering is whether these labels may actually play a role also in this gap that we have between familiar and unfamiliar faces. So this gap has been primarily studied so far from the perceptual perspective, and what we wanted to see whether presenting faces with same or different labels is also going to contribute to this gap in performance. So this is a series of studies that I ran with Tal Honig in my lab, and what we asked participants is to tell for different for pairs of faces, they had to say whether they are same or different. And we trained different group of subjects with those same faces by either presenting them with different labels, no labels, or same labels. For all the pairs of faces that were presented in this experiment, they were trained before that with the same label or different label with no labels. So with no labels, they can only base their judgment on perceptual information. And when we present them with same labels or different labels, they can also use this conceptual information, and then we can see how it may influence their identity decisions. Okay. So what you see here is the proportion of same responses for faces, pairs of faces, and we have many of them. Some of them are same identity, some of them are different identity, and each X or circle here is a different pairs of faces. And you see that when we present them with no labels, they're intermediate rating score, and when the faces are presented with a different label, we get lower proportion of same responses, and when they're presented with the same label, we get higher proportion of same responses. We can also look at the accuracy. So now I'm going to separate them to same identity and different identity. First, you see each dot here again is a pair of faces. You see that there's high variability. Some of the same identity faces get low proportion correct responses. Here, the correct response is going to be same, and some get high proportion correct. So this depends on their perceptual similarity, because here they don't, in the no label condition, they don't have any other information. They only have the information from perceptual information, and they're making many errors. On average, there is only 70% correct for the same identity and 75% on different identity. When the faces are learned with different labels, we see that the proportion correct goes down for the same identity faces. When they are learned with same label, the proportion correct goes up for same identity faces. And here on the different identity faces, it goes in the other way. So it seems that perception alone here is not providing us enough information in order to make the correct decisions. And then we rely on the conceptual information that we provide the subject during the learning in order to make the decision, which may either improve performance or decrease performance. Here you can see it, we plotted with an ROC curve, where we see that the green line is the performance for faces presented with no labels, and we see that performance is kind of like intermediate. And the yellow line is when the label and the identity are congruent, so that may improve performance. But you can also see that when the label and the objective identity is incongruent, we can get performance almost down to a chance level. So what it shows is that when because we cannot rely fully on the perceptual information, we use the conceptual information, and then that may drive performance in the different directions depending on the type of the conceptual information that we provide to the faces. Okay. So to summarize everything, and this here I try to answer to Sharon's question, and then if you have more questions, and let me know. So answering the question of how these features are learned, what I want to suggest is that I think we learn these perceptual features from concepts to percepts. So during our life, we gain experience with familiar faces, starting with our family members and neighbors and friends and colleagues. And these faces are not pure perceptual images. They are associated with unique conceptual information. It could be the voices, the smell, the social context, semantic and episodic information. It provides supervised or semi-supervised information. Based on that, we can then learn what are the perceptual features that define the identity of the face based on this conceptual learning. And based on this perceptual space that we generate, we can now apply that also to unfamiliar faces. So, and then the generalization to unfamiliar faces may not be perfect. There are some features that are common to all faces, and we can use them in order to discriminate both familiar and unfamiliar faces. But there is some additional information that we only have about familiar faces, and that information also includes the conceptual information that we have about them. Okay, so just to summarize everything, how do humans recognize faces? I showed you a subset of view-invariant facial features that account for face identification. We found them based on our psychophysical experiments, and also showed that deep convolutional neural network that are trained on faces is sensitive to the same features. We showed that experience with faces is important in order to learn those face identity features. And then what I also showed is that perception alone cannot account for face recognition, that conceptual information also plays an important role during the process by which we learn those features, and then those features are also used for identification of any other faces, and they can be generalized well maybe to some subset of faces, and to other race faces or to infant faces, these features don't generalize as well. And this is why we don't perform this task very well. Okay, so just before I end, I would like to thank the students who worked with me on this experiment, Naftali Aburdaham and Linoy Schwartz and Tal Honig. I showed those experiments, and also the other students in my lab. So thank you so much for and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you, Galit, very much for a lovely and very interesting and inspiring talk. And I want to invite everybody to unmute themselves and give a big applause to Galit. And I'm opening the stage for questions. I've got some of my own, but I'm letting others start.
Okay, I'll start. Beautiful talk as usual, Galit. But I wonder, devil advocate, let's say I take your 5 features and I scramble them. In other words, I put the eyebrows below. So all the 5 critical features are there, but they are in the non-holistic proper positioning. I assume you will not be able to recognize the faces, no? So it's not just the critical features that are important.
Right, so the critical features in the correct location, right? No, we didn't try to scramble them, and when we tested them, we always tested them within the context of the face and within their correct locations. No,
But
I'm not suggesting that the isolated features are important.
But even if I put them in correct order with no other features, again, I'm not sure I could recognize the face. I don't know, I'm asking it as a question, actually.
Right, so and then again, it's not that it's all or none, right? And I think it's gradual. Those are important. They seem to account for most of the information. And then the other features can also contribute in addition to that, okay? But if we remove those features, if we just change other features, then we can still recognize it.
Yes,
so
yes.
We mainly use that in order to try to see how we can account for the way faces from different views can be moved together, closer together in face space, and how we can move farther apart different identity faces.
Okay.
I also want to add that Rafi, what you suggested is actually diverting away from face space, because these creature or these, scrambling the facial feature location will actually not create a real face. So, I mean, it's not something that we will encounter ever in real life.
If the face is built out of only these 5 dimensions, then but I think what Galit is saying is that it's not only these 5 dimensions, but many others.
You could easily test that by creating like an average face and then just building onto it those specific features and see how recognizable they are.
But this is not removing all other features, right? You're just using an average face.
Well, it would be using all the other features would essentially be the same across all the different faces. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Okay. I want to ask if you think that these associations or conceptual information will be present in the face perception network. Or do you think that for familiar faces or ones that are we've got quite a bit of associations for, or some associations, it will just create additional associations that go out of the face perception network? So where do you think this information may be present?
Right, so this is a difference actually between the networks and humans, the fact that we are more sensitive to specific labels and not to other labels, because the network can get any label, right? So I think that's related to the way we store faces in memory. Familiar faces are faces stored in memory, and they are stored as concepts. I think this is what I was trying to kind of like highlight, that they are stored in concepts, and these they're actually concepts, and this is why during learning and during a face recognition task, we have this benefit from learning them as a conceptual representation and not as like a face and a symbol, or a face and an object name, right? So I think that relates more to the memory aspect than to the perceptual matching aspect of the representation.
So do you think this information lies within in humans, not in the artificial networks, in the face perception network, or it's just additional connectivity that strengthens the actual representation but goes outside of the face perception network?
I think it's outside the face perception network. It's in the way we represent familiar faces in memory, and the network is a model of the perceptual aspect of the system.
Okay. Lovely. Okay, thank you.
I have a question about development that kind of springs up out of this. So if it's true that what we're doing when we're trying to, let's say, learn about people's identities is we're using something like semantic information, well, you can imagine a very young, let's say, infant who's learning all of the faces around him, but doesn't really know how to label things yet. They don't have language, say, at a very, very young age, but they can perceive and presumably learn faces, like infants
Right.
learn who their mother is very, very young, right?
So you don't need language. You have smell, you have voice, right? And those are labels as much as the semantic information, right? Because they are unique, right? So they can be used as labels.
So that's kind of what I was getting at, is beyond just things like language. What do you think are kind of like the border conditions for what you would think of as labels for faces or for identities? Like if you had to guess at sort of what's the kind of minimum information that you could give somebody,
as long as it's unique. Once it's unique and it's not in the visual representation, then it would be a conceptual label that you can use and can be useful for categorization. Okay. If it's not unique, then it's not useful. And we have many of these unique conceptual labels, right, that are associated with faces.
I'm also thinking, though, I mean, we may often end up in situations where we learn several different labels paired with one face that aren't unique, but there's sort of this, let's say, convergence between labels that relate to one identity.
You mean like a name that it could be many Johns or things like that, or?
Yeah. Yeah, kind of thing. Like I know 50 people named John, or I know 50 people who smell similar to one another, or you know what I mean?
Yeah, right. So it would be a combination, right? But as long as it's unique, then it's useful.
Okay.
And what I was trying to say is that this is an inherent part of the training. It's not something that we can kind of like wash away and say, well, we only use the perceptual information. It's just part of the representation and the important for learning.
Galit? Do you think this could be useful for training? I'm thinking about people with prosopagnosia or anyone who just feels like they're not that good at recognizing faces. And there was always this assumption that this is something, global, that's hard to teach, that we are either, or the training that was used was really looking at these distances between different things in the face. This is very different, right? Telling people these are the 5 important things to focus on. Ignore everything else. Just try to focus on this and then on these 2 and then something else. Have you tried anything like that?
So actually we tested prosopagnosis on the feature and they use those features, actually. They are sensitive to those features. So this is not the problem. I thought that you were going somewhere else. I thought that you were asking whether we can train prosopagnosis conceptually and not only perceptually, because all the training that was done so far on prosopagnosis was perceptually. And what I'm claiming is that we don't learn faces perceptually. We learn them, the people who recognize faces, right? We learn them conceptually. So maybe we need to train the prosopagnosis also on conceptual learning tasks and not perceptual tasks. And that may be related actually to, I think, what Galia is showing in an fMRI data, that it's actually the connections between perception and higher level areas that is the problem in prosopagnosia, and not the FFA, right? Not the perceptual representation. So if we want them to, maybe what they don't do well is to make these connections between the conceptual information, the perceptual information, and this is why they don't discriminate well the faces. So it's not, what I was trying to say is that the conceptual information is important to learn the perceptual information, but you need it in order to discriminate between different faces.
Thank you.
I see that Rosil has raised your hand. Do you want to ask anything?
Yeah, actually related to the last question. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts about like the bit where you say how well a label associates with a face. So for example, the teacher or John to a certain face. What do you think, like, where does this come from? Is it per individual? Like, do I have a certain idea of which faces fit a teacher, or is it a more like societal thing where it comes from? Do you have some thoughts on this?
Right. So and I think that the question is, what we did here is we each face was randomly associated with different labels. We didn't look at the consistency between whether someone looks like a teacher or looks like a manager, right? When we tried to test that, we didn't see that it has much a bigger effect, whether we use a person that looks like a teacher and give them a teacher label, right? But yeah, that would be another way in which you could use the connections between conceptual and perceptual information.
Do you think it's then different with like in-group versus out-group, which labels fit? So for example, if I don't have experience with a certain group, I won't associate them that well with lawyers or teachers or whatever?
I'm not sure. I think that there are some, universal labels that are typically associated with faces, and we tried those, but we also have other studies in which we ask people to rate faces based on different traits. So, how trustworthy, how intelligent is the person, and we see that when faces are evaluated based on those traits, then subjects can recognize them better than if you rate them based on perceptual information. So this is also another paradigm in which we see that generating a conceptual representation of a face improves recognition versus generating a pure perceptual information of a face.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
Peter, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, thanks. And I finally found how to raise my hand. Brilliant talk again, Galit. Thank you. Just one quick comment about the importance of labels. That anyone who's tried reading a book from some other culture that uses names with which you're unfamiliar, it's really hard to keep track of the characters. You can't relate them to anything. Whereas if they're familiar names, then you can. So I'm sure the same thing happens when you're learning faces. My question was about the deep neural network. You showed us that the early representations for the object-trained network were very similar to the face-trained network. I was just wondering what that face-trained network was, because a lot of the face networks are actually built on object-trained networks. They take an image net and then retrain them on faces. So
right.
Was that one of those, or was it?
So we did both. We actually trained it from scratch on faces, and we also fine-tuned the object-trained network on the faces in order to see how many layers we need to train in order to make it a face-like network. So, and we compared between a network we trained from scratch and the fine-tuning, and we got the same thing.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's all thank Galit again for a wonderful and inspiring talk. And thank you very much for joining us. And we'll be here next week at our usual time, not this time, but 12 p.m. Israel time, which is too early for most East Coast participants, but we hopefully will have all the talks recorded on our YouTube channel so you can join. Next week we have Peter Aroafzema from the Netherlands. So I'll send an invitation to everybody and you can see all the details. Thanks again, Galit, for a wonderful talk.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye. See you. Thank you, everybody.